Liora Vance stood at her husband Draven's gravesite with dry eyes and a trembling hand, while just 2 hours later, his brother Silas uncovered the first clue that would unravel a web of lies, betrayal and murder she thought had been buried. With the body. Liora Vance stood motionless beneath a grey sky as the final shovelful of dirt hit the polished oak casket. Her black veil fluttered slightly in the wind, but her expression never changed. Around her, the cemetery filled with the quiet sniffles of friends and relatives, all mourning the sudden loss of Draven Vance, a man known for his brilliance and generosity. To everyone watching, Liora was the picture of dignity, silent, composed, heartbreak beautifully restrained behind a poised exterior. She hadn't cried once since the accident. Some took it as strength. Others whispered that grief hadn't sunk in yet, but no one dared question her love for her husband. After all, they had been married for 7 years, and by all accounts, their marriage had been loving, if a bit quiet. Draven's death had shocked everyone. Just a week earlier, he was driving home from a late meeting when his car suddenly veered off a remote mountain road. Authorities said he likely fell asleep at the wheel. No foul play was suspected. The funeral came together fast, thanks to Liora's insistence on honoring his memory without delay. She oversaw every detail, from the hymn selection to the flower, arrangements, and even gave a brief eulogy that ended in a solemn bow of her head. Then, without a word to anyone, she slipped into the back of the waiting black sedan and disappeared. Draven's younger brother, Silas Vance, had flown in from Greece just a day before the funeral. He was a freelance journalist with a reputation for digging deeper than most. Though years had passed since he and Draven last spoke at length, Silas always felt a deep connection with his older brother, who had practically raised him after their parents passed. Watching Liora during the funeral sparked something unsettling inside him. It wasn't just her calm, it was how rehearsed it felt. Not once did her hand tremble. Not once did her voice break. She greeted mourners like a hostess, not a widow. It bothered Silas more than he cared to admit. As people gathered afterward for a quiet memorial at the Vance estate, Liora was nowhere to be found. Erin Knox, the family's longtime attorney, told Silas that Liora had declined to host any gathering, citing exhaustion. Instead, she arranged for food to be delivered and left a brief thank you note for those who attended. Silas stood by the fireplace, sipping untouched tea. As he studied the photos on the mantel, one of them showed Draven and Liora on their wedding day. Her in a sleek ivory gown, Draven in a tailored suit, both smiling. Though now that he looked closer, he realized her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Family friends tried to engage, Silas in conversations about work and travel, but his mind wandered. He kept noticing small things. How every photo of Draven had been dusted and scented. How not a single personal item of his was out in the open. No watch, no glasses. Not even the antique book collection he loved. The house looked sanitized, as if someone had carefully removed all signs that Draven had ever lived there. That evening, after the guests had trickled out, Silas sat alone in the study, thinking about the last phone call he had received from Draven. It was 3 weeks ago. Draven had sounded tired and distracted. He had mentioned wanting to talk about something important. Silas promised to call back the next day, but work got in the way. Now, that conversation would never happen. Before heading out, Silas wandered the halls one last time. He paused at the door to Draven's private office, which had always been locked. Something about that door pulled at him, but he told himself to let it go, at least for now. He left the estate with a knot in his chest and a strange certainty that the story of his brother's death wasn't finished. Later that night, while lying in the guest room of a nearby inn, Silas scrolled through old emails from Draven. One stood out, a message from 2 months ago. It had no subject line and only one sentence. If anything happens to me, don't trust appearances. Silas sat up straight, heart pounding. He reread it 3 times. It wasn't paranoia. It was a warning. He hadn't understood it then, but now, After watching Liora walk away from the gravesite without a flicker of emotion, the message echoed like a drumbeat in his mind. Something was wrong, and Silas intended to find out exactly what it was. 2 hours after the funeral, the Vance mansion sat quiet under the heavy gloom of dusk. The scent of lilies still lingered in the air, left behind by the floral arrangements that had decorated the service. Most of the guests had gone home. The caterers had cleared out. The staff, dismissed by Liora earlier in the afternoon, had left the sprawling property empty except for one person, Silas Vance. He had returned to the house on a silent impulse, not entirely sure why. He told himself it was to pick up a few belongings of sentimental value. A watch that once belonged to their father. A compass Draven had carried through his hiking trips. Maybe even a photo or two. But as he stepped inside the house, the silence pressed down on him like thick fog. Every step on the polished hardwood floors echoed unnaturally loud, as if the house resented his presence. He passed the grand piano in the foyer, the same one Draven used to play on quiet evenings. It was covered with a fine layer of dust. That seemed off. Liora had always kept the house pristine, but lately it seemed she had only cleaned where it mattered, where others could see. The deeper Silas walked into the home, the more he noticed things that didn't add up. Blank spaces on the walls where paintings had once hung. Empty shelves that used to hold awards and framed certificates. Drawers half open, but with nothing inside. It felt more like a house being moved out of than one mourning a recent death. He found himself once again standing before the heavy oak door of Draven's study. It had been locked at the funeral, just as it had always been in life. Silas remembered being told as a child never to enter without permission. But now, with Draven gone, and the nagging voice in his head growing louder, he decided it was time. He searched instinctively, checking the obvious spots, and there it was, taped to the underside of a drawer in the hallway table. A small bronze key. He didn't hesitate. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open slowly. Draven's study was untouched. Or at least, it appeared that way at first glance. The air was stale, and dust had gathered on the desk, but everything seemed to be in place. Books lined the shelves, his leather chair faced the window, and the old lamp with the cracked shade sat in the corner. Silas stepped inside and began examining the desk. The drawers were mostly empty, except for a few pens, a lighter, and a business card. But behind a stack of outdated blueprints, his fingers brushed against something unusual, a steel safe embedded into the back wall of the bottom drawer. It was small, portable, and had a digital keypad. Silas stared at it for a moment, then typed in the only code that made sense, Draven's birthday. The screen blinked, and the lock released with a soft click. Inside, Silas found a bundle of cash, a sealed envelope, and a USB drive labelled, in neat handwriting, "For Silas, if I die unnaturally." His breath caught in his throat. He plugged the drive into his laptop immediately, hands trembling. There were 4 video files, each about 10 minutes long. He played the first one. The screen flickered before showing Draven, sitting in the very room Silas now stood in. His face was pale, tired, his voice low and grim. He said he didn't know if he was being paranoid or if something real was unfolding around him. But he had begun noticing strange behavior from Liora. Secret calls she would hang up the moment he entered the room. Late-night outings with vague explanations. Withdrawals from joint accounts that she claimed were for home repairs, though no repairs had ever been done. In the second video, Draven described a moment that haunted him. He had checked the GPS on Liora's car and found her visiting a private rental cabin several towns away, at least 4 times in a single month. She claimed she was helping a friend through a divorce, but she had no friends by that name. Draven had looked it up. The cabin had been rented under an alias. He'd even driven out there once, but it had already been vacated. By the third video, Draven's voice was harder, less unsure. He said he believed someone was helping Liora, that it wasn't just an affair, it was something more. something planned. He spoke about updating his will and moving a portion of his money into a private trust. He said if anything happened to him, and it didn't make sense, the answers would be in this safe. The last video chilled Silas the most. Draven said plainly, "If I die suddenly, you must look at her. She may act devastated, but don't be fooled. Everything about her is performance." Silas sat back in the chair, the video ending, his hands still frozen on the keyboard. The woman the world had just mourned with, the one everyone praised for her grace and grief, was now a suspect in his mind. The puzzle pieces hadn't clicked fully yet, but the edges were becoming visible. Something terrible had been hidden behind her calm demeanor, and Silas had just stepped into a mystery far darker than he'd ever imagined. The morning after discovering the videos, Silas awoke with a pounding heart and 100 questions. The quiet certainty in Draven's voice haunted him. His brother hadn't just suspected betrayal, he had anticipated his own death. That level of fear didn't come from baseless paranoia. Silas knew that. Something real had pushed Draven to record those videos, to hide the drive, and to reach out across death's barrier in a desperate attempt to be heard. Silas couldn't let that go. He returned to the study, this time with a sharper eye. The room no longer felt like a shrine. It felt like evidence. He scanned every shelf and drawer for clues that might explain who Draven believed Liora was involved with. The videos hadn't named anyone specific, but one detail kept repeating in his mind. The rental cabin. A secluded place. Multiple visits. Rented under an alias. Silas grabbed his laptop and began researching property rentals near the town Draven had mentioned. After an hour of digging, he found it. A modest 2-bedroom cabin listed under the name Anders Clem. The profile looked clean, too clean. No personal photos, no reviews, and only a single blurry profile picture. Silas checked the rental logs. The cabin had been booked sporadically, for the past year, usually on weekends. And interestingly, each booking coincided with one of Liora's supposed volunteer retreats. The last reservation had ended 2 days before Draven's death. With a new surge of urgency, Silas drove out to the address. The cabin sat in a wooded area, quiet and surrounded by pine trees. It was locked, but Silas walked the perimeter, looking through the windows. Inside, it was simple. Basic furniture, minimal decoration, but a pair of wine glasses sat on the counter beside a corkscrew and an opened bottle of red wine. A coat was still hanging on a hook by the door. Someone had been there recently. Behind the cabin, Silas noticed tire tracks that led into the trees. He followed them for several minutes until he found what looked like a small fire pit and folding chairs, clearly used for private meetings. Tucked between one of the chairs and a fallen log, he spotted a receipt half buried in the dirt. It was damp, but readable. It had been issued to a man named Ezra Grail. The name jolted something in Silas's memory. Ezra Grail had once worked at the same biotech firm as Draven, a quiet, brilliant man with a background in chemical research. He had vanished from the company about a year ago after a sudden resignation. Silas searched the name online and found an old photo. Though it had been a few years, the man bore a striking resemblance to the profile picture on the cabin rental. Back in town, Silas went straight to the local courthouse to dig deeper. A few hours of patient searching paid off. He uncovered records, showing that Ezra Grail had recently changed his name to Anders Clem. That explained the alias. Even more alarming was the discovery that Ezra, now Anders, had been tied to a small biotech startup that dissolved after a scandal involving embezzlement and unauthorized experiments. The company's assets were never traced. That evening, Silas sat in the quiet of his motel room, piecing everything together. Draven suspected Liora of betrayal. Liora had lied about where she was going. A hidden partner, now identified as Ezra Grail, had a checkered past and vanished from the public eye. And now, Draven was dead under suspicious circumstances, with no sign of foul play, yet a chilling video trail suggesting otherwise. Silas couldn't prove anything concrete yet, but one thing became clear. Draven had been silenced. Whether by Accident or design, it had benefited Liora. She now controlled all his assets. There was no will registered with the attorney Draven had spoken to just months earlier. At least, not one filed. Erin Knox, the family's long-trusted lawyer, had insisted everything remained unchanged. That was another red flag. If Draven had indeed updated his will and moved funds to a trust, where were those documents? Determined to get answers, Silas contacted a friend named Callan Meyer, a digital forensics expert. He sent over a copy of the USB contents and asked for help tracing any digital breadcrumbs, emails, account changes, cloud backups, anything that could support what Draven had feared. As the sky turned dark outside the motel window, Silas stared out into the trees. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He was now part of the story Draven had started, but couldn't finish. The lies ran deeper than he had ever imagined. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. But Silas had uncovered the first crack, and once a crack formed, it was only a matter of time before the entire facade shattered. Callan Meyer worked fast. By the next afternoon, Silas had a secure message waiting in his inbox. Attached were fragments of deleted files Callan had recovered from the USB and a string of usernames linked to Liora's hidden online presence. None of them were tied to her real name, but Callan, skilled in data pattern recognition, had traced her activity to several encrypted email accounts, private message threads, and hidden folders. The contents of those folders revealed the darkest truth yet. Among the files were drafts of letters never sent, expense documents, and most damning, a scan of a will signed by Draven Vance just 2 weeks before his death. In it, Draven had removed Liora as his primary beneficiary, instead transferring control of his financial assets to a trust managed anonymously. The original copy had clearly never been filed legally, which explained why Erin Knox, the family lawyer, claimed no changes existed. But Silas now had proof that Draven had intended to cut Liora out of everything. Silas arranged a meeting with Erin Knox under the guise of discussing memorial arrangements. The lawyer was cordial but guarded. Silas brought up the new will casually, watching Erin's expression shift slightly, tightening at the corners. He claimed he had no knowledge of such a document, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Silas pushed harder, mentioning a storage facility Draven once mentioned, where he kept important personal files. Erin's composure cracked for the briefest moment. That was all Silas needed. He wasted no time driving across the city to the facility. After some convincing and a forged signature that he regretted but justified, Silas accessed Draven's unit. The metal door creaked open to reveal shelves stacked with labeled boxes, old awards, and journals. Among them, Silas found a safe tucked behind a stack of storage bins. Inside was the original will, signed, dated, and notarized. There were also photographs, blurry but unmistakable images of Liora with Ezra Grail, locked in intimate embraces outside the cabin. The truth was finally visible in full color. Liora had been planning something with Ezra. Draven had discovered their betrayal and taken steps to protect himself and his legacy. And now Draven was dead, of sudden heart failure, a condition he had never been diagnosed with. That detail gnawed at Silas's thoughts. He requested a copy of the coroner's report and had it reviewed by a friend who was a toxicology consultant. After a few days, the results came back with a quiet but chilling confirmation. The level of digoxin, a potent medication used to treat heart conditions, was suspiciously high in Draven's blood at the time of death. There had been no prescription for the drug. The coroner had listed it as natural due to no visible trauma, but Silas now understood the truth. Draven had been poisoned. Silas wrestled with the next move. Going to the police was obvious, but he lacked a clear link between the poison and Liora. Circumstantial evidence, emails, and even the will weren't enough. He needed something undeniable. So he watched Liora, quietly, closely. She had already begun the process of selling off Draven's properties and moving funds into overseas accounts. Through the help of Callan, Silas traced a hidden transaction, connecting Liora's account to one registered in Ezra's new name. It was labeled under a dummy corporation. Everything was disguised, but the trail was clear if you followed the right paths. Then, a break, a recording. One of the hidden email accounts Liora had used also linked to a cloud storage folder. Inside, it were surveillance logs, voice notes, some of which had captured private phone calls between her and Ezra. They had recorded themselves, encrypted the files, and stored them as a form of leverage against each other. In one, Liora confessed to slipping a small dose of the mix into Draven's wine over several nights. Her tone was calm, her words rehearsed. She claimed it had made things easier, peaceful even. She never said the drug's name, but it didn't matter. The intent was unmistakable. Silas downloaded everything: hours of data, photos, financial records, audio proof. He compiled it all into a folder labeled for justice and reached out to a detective named Thane Corrin, a retired investigator with a reputation for taking on quietly buried cases. Silas sent him everything, requesting a meeting. As dusk fell, Silas sat in the study that once belonged to his brother, holding Draven's watch in one hand and the original will in the other. He was closer to justice than ever, but he also understood the cost. Liora wasn't going to walk away from this easily. She had built her future on calculated deceit, and when cornered, people like her didn't hesitate to strike again. But Silas no longer felt fear. He had walked through the shadows. His brother had died in, and now he was bringing the truth into the light. The morning of the meeting with Thane Corrin, Silas felt a calm he hadn't known in weeks. It was the kind of stillness that came with purpose. He had everything: proof of fraud, adultery, theft, and now premeditated murder. The puzzle was finally complete, and now it was time to reveal the picture to someone with the authority to act. Thane met Silas in a quiet corner of a coffee shop just outside the city. He was older, weathered by decades of service, and had the heavy stare of someone who'd seen far too much to be easily surprised. But as Silas laid out the evidence, document by document, recording by recording, Thane's composure changed. The seasoned investigator leaned in closer, eyes narrowing with each new revelation. The moment he heard Liora's voice on the encrypted recording admitting to drugging Draven, he nodded slowly and said they had enough to move. Thane made a few calls. Within 48 hours, a full investigation was opened. Warrants were issued for digital accounts, banking transfers, and the storage facility. Silas turned over the physical documents, the USB drive, and even the laptop Draven had used in his final months. The new forensic team combed through it all, while Thane quietly pushed the district attorney's office for an expedited hearing. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the weight of evidence, the court moved quickly. Liora was arrested at a luxury hotel just outside the state line. She was caught in the middle of making final preparations to leave the country. Ezra Grail was arrested the same night at a private airstrip registered under his shell corporation. Both were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, identity deception, and obstruction of justice. The news exploded across every media outlet. Widow charged in husband's poisoning became the headline on every channel. Friends and former colleagues of Draven were stunned. The story of a devoted wife unraveling into a calculated killer shocked the entire community. But for Silas, the most unsettling part was how easily Liora had worn her mask. Her mourning had seemed so genuine. Her sorrow had fooled even the most perceptive. The trial began months later. Liora maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a grieving wife framed by jealous relatives and outdated digital records. Her defense tried to paint Silas as an opportunist seeking inheritance and attention. But the facts were too strong. The emails, the hidden will, the photos at the cabin, the money trail, and especially the voice recordings sealed her fate. Ezra, faced with overwhelming evidence, took a deal and turned on Liora. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he admitted to their affair and revealed how Liora had slowly administered digoxin over several weeks. He claimed she had convinced him it would be painless, that Draven would never suffer, that it was humane. The courtroom fell silent when those words were spoken. Liora was convicted on all counts. The judge called her a danger to anyone, whoever trusted her. She was sentenced to life without parole. Ezra received 15 years with the possibility of release after 10 for his cooperation. The final blow to Liora's legacy came when the judge officially recognized the original will Silas had recovered, thereby nullifying her claim to any of Draven's estate. In the months that followed, Silas worked with a non-profit dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths. He donated Draven's property to scientific research and ensured the cabin was torn down. He didn't want any place tied to his brother's final suffering to remain standing. One afternoon, Silas stood at Draven's grave. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything he'd done, the sleepless nights, the risky searches, the painful discoveries, had all led to this moment of quiet justice. Draven had left behind breadcrumbs, and Silas had followed every one of them. That bond between brothers had stretched beyond death. The last file Silas opened from the encrypted drive was a short note. A message from Draven, meant only for him. It read, "If you're seeing this, then I didn't make it. But I know you'll do what's right. I trust you, Silas. I always have." As the wind rustled through the trees and the sun dipped behind the horizon, Silas finally felt the weight lift. The truth had been buried deep, hidden beneath grief, betrayal, and layers of manipulation. But now it was free. And with it, so was Draven's memory, no longer a victim of lies, but a voice that had been heard.